everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of the podcast. This week, we're talking about the West and virtue ethics. So we are reading, if you're an undergraduate, is Chapter 6 in Richardson's West for Mathematics, and Chapter 17 in our Schaefer-Lambda text on virtue ethics. If you're a graduate student or an advanced student or just interested in reading more, you read Walter L. Hickson's American Settler Colonialism, Greg Pence's Virtue Ethics. I don't believe any relation to Mike Pence, I don't think. And Brian Van Norden's Virtue Ethics and Confucianism. So that's what we're going to talk about this week.
So for Richardson, it was Chapter 6.
Yep.
It's really about this shift in the 80s. There's sort of this, there's some prosperity, right? I think it's industries are consolidating. You have the rise of trust. You also have the counter to trust, right? Joseph Pulitzer buys the New York World from Jay Gould in 1883 and takes this public stand against, monopolists.
Yeah.
You also have the Supreme Court overturning the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is, right, again, chipping away at Reconstruction, right?
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
traditionally see the end of Reconstruction in 1877, but this Supreme Court decision really strikes a deep blow to civil rights. And then I believe next week we'll probably get more into the rise of discontented farmers,
Yeah.
and whatnot. But what the main sort of focus, I guess, the character in this chapter is Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And Teddy Roosevelt,
He's a great character, especially for this in relation to Red Dead Redemption. Too.
Oh yeah, definitely. He's nominated 1888 in the Republican Party within the state of New York, and he vows to be, I'm not going to be owned by no man, and I'll go to Albany untrammeled and unpledged and vote independently. And what he's reflecting is this, right? Is Richardson's been arguing this mainstream American view against special interests, whether it's believed to be newly emancipated African Americans or this increasingly large, expanding big business becoming trusts, that sort of thing. Yeah, the monopoly. The Andrew Carnegies or the Leviticus Cornwall, right, in the game. But importantly, when we think of Roosevelt, one of the key events is his wife's death in 1884, and then he loses at the convention, and then he heads west to clear his mind. It's a reset, and this is where he comes together with, this ideal, which is very much a part of Red Dead Redemption, that world, right, where he met his ideal American, right, hardworking, loyal, helpful, independent, and this is where this vision of the ideal American, where there's absolute equality of individuals, and it's based according to individual merit rather than social status.
Yeah. And
again, this is sort of this ideal. It's both sort of, when we think of Roosevelt and sort of this class of people, there's, obviously, white supremacy involved in this. But I think the important thing in this is this idea of this ideal that is used as a wedge or a hammer against the ideas of special interests.
Yeah.
Right. And again, when we're looking at Richardson's argument, this is the thing that goes past, right, 1900 into the 20th century. Whether it's real or not, the idea that there's equality of individuals and it's all based on merit.
Yeah.
The other part, too, is Roosevelt's desire to use government to protect middle-class family and the individualistic West. So there is government intervention, but it's in the name of protecting the middle class.
Yeah.
Right, and it's predominantly a white middle class. But that also, right, forms into the kind of the hypocrisy of American government either protecting the rights of African Americans or um, helping big business, protecting big business.
Yeah.
This almost becomes another version of that, but it's the accepted
Yeah.
version.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not, thwarting of the majority's will,
Yeah.
and that's very important. It's sort of the contradiction out in the open that doesn't become a contradiction because that's just the way it should be.
Yeah.
Um,
This is a good reminder, just generally thinking about the game, about how in the game there's all of this talk of like independence and we're on our own in the West, but there's also cans everywhere, and there's railroad infrastructure. There's all these things where you aren't really on your own. You need infrastructure. You need all this help from the more industrialized areas back east. Otherwise, that sort of life of ultimate freedom and autonomy is not really possible.
yeah, it's
Right?
just it's on a
You
yeah
need the government help, but also you don't want it for those people or something, right?
yeah.
And you want to say, I didn't get any help or something.
Or you don't, if you want the government's help, you want it in specific areas, but not in other areas.
Yes,
Right.
that's right. Yeah.
And that's really the big, right, kind of, again, it's the contradiction that is not seen as a contradiction. It's seen as more of a expectation or
Yeah.
entitlement, I guess you could, probably the best word. But also the idea that there's this public fear of government um, rewarding the wrong people with entitlement.
Sure.
Um, And this is also, right, this moment where Western outlaws, right, as Richardson notes, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, they're criminals, but they are also portrayed as representatives of American individualism, family, loyalty, all in the face of a hostile government tied to business.
Yeah.
And this is really interesting because, the first thing I think of during that is, the Whiskey Rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
right, where Washington has to go put it down. But and you're kind of you're torn because it's George Washington, he must be right in this instance, but
Yeah.
then when you read into it you're like they're just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And wait, why am I celebrating Washington putting down the Whiskey Rebellion
Yeah.
in a different era, or if that event was moved to this era, we would be celebrating the Whiskey Rebellion and
Yeah.
Washington's. It's all about he's an authoritarian trying to put down
Sure.
this popular right
Yes.
expression.
Yeah.
But at the we have these outlaws that become avatars, right? Like
Yes.
symbols of
Yeah.
I always think of that. It's even to contemporary celebrations or the mafia, right? Think
Yeah.
of Sopranos,
These anti-heroes.
yeah, Goodfellas, because they do have codes,
Yep.
but they live this kind of free lifestyle,
Yeah.
right?
And of course, I think these things sometimes occur in the context of government inefficiency or corruption, right? So you have, at least this is I guess the story that like the mafia in Italy likes to tell, right? Which as I understand has some level of truth to it, which is, the monarchy, the king, the nobles are going to do what they want to do, and if one of them, one of their sons assaults one of your daughters, you can't go to the king and petition for any help. So then people start banding together and meting out their own kind of justice and striking back against the government. You have this with the, I don't remember if it's Jesse James, but some of the outlaws, isn't it noted that like they go to banks and like torch mortgage papers so people don't, or maybe this is a later historical era. That
Yeah,
I'm
I could see that.
but like
yeah.
this is the kind of thing where it's like, well, they're really on our side,
Mhm.
so they're good, right? And they maybe represent this American ideal. And so I think this is a good segue into thinking about virtue ethics, both this and Teddy Roosevelt, because virtue ethics is really in many ways quite different than the other ethical theories we've studied in class thus far. For one, it's incredibly old. Did the reading, that it goes back to like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and also right on the other side of the world, plausibly Confucius or something like that. And so that's all a very long time ago, right? Certainly, there aren't utilitarians. In ancient China, there's a kind of consequentialism and something that looks kind of like utilitarianism in what's called Moist philosophy. But you just don't see some of these other things until much later, but you do kind of see this thing for a long time. And virtue ethics is really about, how do I live a good life? What is my character like? What kind of person do I want to be? This is, I think, a helpful lens for us to use when we think about Red Dead Redemption, Because this is a thing that Arthur and many of the people think about. It's like, what do I want my life to look like, and what kind of person am I, right? If you've been playing, Dan and I were talking earlier. I think he's still in the third chapter, and I'm right at the beginning of the fourth. And so, we're starting to see the game progress, and Arthur is very troubled at times about what the gang is doing, and maybe concerned about his own past actions. And so, that reflection on what kind of person am I, what kind of person will I be, is really, really to think about for something like virtue ethics. So, if you read the text, either the required one or the additional ones, you know that virtue ethics is about that word first in it, virtue, right? Which is about these stable dispositional character traits that people have. And then, people disagree about exactly what the virtues are, how many of them should I have. But it's supposed to be the kind of thing where that's kind of my aim, right? My moral aim is not necessarily to follow an abstract rule that I can universalize, or even to incorporate a principle, treat every person as an end rather than a means. And it's certainly not, I'm going to do a big calculation about how my actions affect all the possible people and entities and things that it could affect, but just, well, what kind of person can I be? And how can I try to improve the kind of person I am? So maybe I want to be more compassionate, more wise. Maybe I want to be more courageous, more moderate. Temperance or moderation was, I think, in many cases for Aristotle, an important virtue, right? People make this joke, everything in moderation except moderation, because you want that everywhere or something, right? So, but that I focus on character traits is a really different look, partly because it's really directed at you as an individual and your internal kind of landscape, whereas, Kant's really concerned with how do I treat others, and consequentialism is concerned with how do I treat others in the whole, everyone I'm affecting. And virtue has that effect, right? If I'm compassionate, I'm going to treat others a certain way, but it's really about how do I develop and polish and, come to have these character traits. And that includes these character traits of virtue or virtues, right? It includes, in terms of my moral evaluation for action, I'm not maybe as concerned about the consequences, although sometimes I might violate a rule if the specifics call for it. I am concerned about my intention, but I'm also, unlike Kant, concerned about what my internal, emotional state is. Am I doing the thing for the right reason? But also, is it the kind of thing that I'm enjoying? If I, go to a soup kitchen, but the whole time, like internally, I'm grumbling and I'm like, oh, I actually loathe these people and stuff. Well, a virtue theorist would say it's not a very virtuous action, because it's not just what you're doing, it's why you're doing it, and to some extent how you're doing it, and the internal life of you as you're doing it, right? The other part about virtue that's, I think, important here is, virtue theory is almost by its nature particularist. And what I mean by that is, virtue theory isn't going to have a general rule. It's more going to be the case that your practical wisdom, what is this? I think in Aristotle, in the Greek, it's the phronimos is like the wise person, the sort of practically wise sage or whatever. And that person has a sensitivity to particular situations. And that is an important thing with virtue ethics. The example that is given in the Van Norden paper is really good at this. Confucius has a student who comes up and says, hey, what should I do about the situation? Confucius says you should, chill out and relax a little bit. Another student comes up and says, what should I do about the situation? He asks some advice for the same kind of thing. And Confucius is like, you should be more aggressive. A third student comes and says, hey, I saw those two interchanges. You gave them different advice. What's up with that? And Confucius says, well, the first person, right, the first disciple that came to me, he's a little hot-headed. He needs to chill out a little bit, right? In that situation, that's what's called for. The second person is really timid, and so they need to be more aggressive, right? That's what's called for. And so virtue ethics, what the right thing is, might depend. It's highly contextual on the people involved and the circumstances and all of that stuff. And a wise person that is a virtuous person is going to be able to have a sense of this, right?
It almost sounds like a management, like if you were managing a group of people or, like a business, you would need this kind of
sensitivity to others.
Because everyone has a different personality, everyone has different quirks, and so you will manage them in different ways. There's no hard and fast rule,
single rule to do it.
Versus when you do see a hard and fast rule management system that just creates havoc.
Sure, that's right.
In the institution
that is not sensitive to the differences of individuals. Yeah. Yeah, this is definitely. It is not at all surprising. There's this guy. I can't remember the guy's name. Maybe Tom Harris. There's this guy that did a bunch of these books that are like they're kind of like applying old philosophical ideas to like contemporary stuff. And he wrote a book called "If Aristotle Ran General Motors,"
Hmm.
and it's kind of about this thing, right? About like how being inflexible and rule bound is not the right way to deal with people, and being sensitive to particulars is. It's also just an attempt to basically get people who don't care about philosophy to care about philosophy, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that sensitivity to context is really important. It's not like you can't have that in consequentialism or utilitarianism, or in deontology and Kantian theory. But for Kant, it's like maybe the rule's got to be specific, but like, what is the rule? And then I got to follow it, right? And in consequentialism, in fact, taking the particulars might actually not be what I want to do, because what I want is what's going to be best for everyone. And so part of what that means is I need to be pretty impartial. I need to maybe care too much about the specifics of your situation, right? In virtue theory, I do have to do that. I think there's, excuse me, all kinds of other things to say. I want to highlight two, I guess, problems or issues with virtue ethics. The first is, or sorry, I what I want to say is I'll mention one thing and then I will hand it back over and we'll come for our sort of objections. Uh, it is common to think that in virtue ethics we need some substantive thing to tell us what the virtues are. I mean, even in courage, the Greeks and Chinese philosophers and contemporary people and Christians all probably have a different account of what courage is, even though they're using the same term for it, right? So we still need something to tell us what the content is. And one way that virtue theorists answer this is what we would describe as like moral exemplarism or an exemplarist ethic. So an exemplar is just someone that's really, really good at a thing, right? Or sort of the top of their game or the top of their class at it. So you could be an exemplar, for example. You could be an exemplar at taking notes in a boring committee meeting or something like that, right? It just means you do it really, really well. So moral exemplar is obviously someone who does morality or moral interaction really, really well. And a common way to do virtue theory is to pick out a moral exemplar and use that as the thing that guides your action. So, of course, in Christianity, the moral exemplar is someone like Jesus, right? Or Jesus. This is when I was growing up. I remember people would always have those wristbands, WWJD, what would Jesus do? That's an easy way to think about that is it's a virtue theoretic kind of religious approach. Um, in Confucianism, the exemplar is Confucius, is Kongzi, which is a little weird because for him, he doesn't think he's the sage. He actually thinks that there are older figures that you should look up to. Maybe if you interpret Taoism as a virtue theory, maybe the Tao Te Ching, the one translation of it is the classic of virtue and excellence and stuff, right? So maybe Lao Tzu is the sage that you look up to. Maybe Zhuangzi, because Zhuangzi is later. Taoist comes along. Regardless, you pick out a person that you think, man, they are the moral exemplar. Even though they haven't given me a rule or whatever, but like every time I look at them, they do the right thing, even in cases where it might be unexpected or difficult or whatever, right? That's who I want to be like, right? And so that aim of exemplarism is a way to give further content that's action guided to virtue theory.
All right.
So in this case, we might think if you're an outlaw, maybe Jesse James is your exemplar. Or if you're a rugged American individualist at this time, maybe Teddy Roosevelt is your exemplar.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us, there's this towards the end of the chapter where Richardson talks about Buffalo Bill Cody.
Great example of a potential exemplar.
Yeah.
A Western exemplar.
And he has a really interesting story, very modern-esque, like someone who, there's there's I'm sure various books on Cody, but just someone who is kind of making stuff up constantly about his life, but continues to just thrive off that and be successful. And so I think the big thing is that the Wild West show.
Yeah. This is with Calamity Jane, right? Or maybe later.
There's all these. He just gathers all these figures together, brings in indigenous people. I think a Sitting Bull.
Oh,
it's kind of this,
okay.
and it's literally like within a year or two after events.
Yeah.
And so if you went and saw this show, which again, it's a show, it's fake.
Yeah.
It's not, it's staged. It's mass theater in a large
Yeah.
sort of, almost like a circusy type tent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's large enough that there's horses and wagons going around.
Oh, interesting.
I mean,
yeah.
it's, stuff, dangerous
It's
stuff.
performance.
Yeah,
It's
accidents
dangerous,
could
but
happen.
performance.
Yeah. But it's all fake.
Yeah. It's like wrestling.
Yeah,
A performance, but
yes,
dangerous.
it's definitely, it has this. But a part of this, right, is as Richardson writes, there's no government surveyors in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. There's no railroad agents. There's no slogging army campaigns, no railroad barons like Leland Stanford manipulating politics. The audience saw brave men riding, roping, shooting, and challenging the lawless bandits and Indians who stood in their way, and the program assured them that everything they saw was true.
Yeah.
And
a beacon of order in a sea of chaos.
Yeah, and it's this paragraph or this sentence,
Yeah.
set of it's definitely. I mean, that is Red Dead because
Yeah.
when you go to play Red Dead, it's a fun game on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
When you come to Red Dead with the history or the philosophy, all of a sudden it means something more.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's fake.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
So it's like you're confronted with this, it's like very much the human contradiction of engaging in something it is wrestling, right? Maybe everything is wrestling at the end of the day. It's fake, but you are emotionally invested in it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, wrestling aside or not, we do this with like other kinds of fictional representations, right? I mean, how many people, if any of you listening have finished Red Dead Redemption, some of you might have cried at the end, right?
Yeah.
I've cried at games. I cried at the end of movies, like books. Sometimes I read them, even if I've read them 1,000 times, I know what's coming.
Yeah.
When a favorite character is like passing or a really tragic thing happens, like it moves me.
Yeah.
This is a very human thing. We get moved by fiction because those representations, we often think they tell us something about ourselves or about the world or about reality.
Yeah. Or it gives
even though they're literally false.
Yeah.
Or
it gives us meaning. Yeah. And I always think of if you're in that clan, hunter-gatherer, there's a reason why the storyteller is so important, or the oral historian, because it's like we live this life.
You need the context.
Yeah, we live this life of chasing after animals.
Yeah,
there's storms and there's other clans that don't like us, but at the end of the day, our lives have meaning.
We are deeply narrative-oriented creatures.
Yeah,
right?
And there's a part of me that's when you get towards the end with the nun.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Such a key moment in Red Dead.
Oh, it's huge.
Because she becomes almost the otherworldly representative, literally a representative of God coming into Arthur's life.
Yep.
And that's where it's almost like he's fine with everything.
Yeah.
And then he just his focus becomes right.
Yep.
We won't give it away.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
But that also brings the tears because it's coming, but that they're okay with it.
They've accepted.
And that's both it's the always think of it. It's the euphoric teardrop.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the euphoric teardrop of a meaningful life fulfilled.
Yes.
And if only you could end your own journey within this grand ending that is, say, E.T.
That's right.
At the end when E.T. ascends in the spaceship.
Yep.
That's a horrible example, but
no, I think that's a great example. This really does go back to the idea of we are narrative seeking creatures. I mean, think about a story, right? A story. You could have a story that's great. I used to really, I mean, I still do, but I used to like Stephen King a lot. I read a lot of Stephen King books when I was younger. And the thing that people always say about Stephen King, which I think is true, is he's a pretty good writer. He's good at certain things in a story, but endings, not a strength. There's always a Deus Ex machina, right? That comes up in the end. And the endings are often dissatisfying. And people talk about this because your story, like how your story ends, can matter for the appraisal of the whole thing. And if you think of your life as a kind of narrative, yeah, you want the whole thing to be good and guided in the right way, but you also want it to end in the right way,
Yeah.
right? And so that is, yeah, that's a it's a good way to think about, what people in America wanted for their story and what they wanted for the story of America or the story of their group
Yeah.
or whatever.
I almost
as well
wonder
as
if
ours,
Stephen
so.
King does it on purpose.
I don't know.
Like
It's a good question.
the ultimate
Yeah.
horror is an unsatisfactory. So you could talk about the most dangerous, horrific events and things.
That's right. Yeah.
But what's really scary is,
Yeah.
as he's typing along, I'm going to bring this to a train wreck. And that is what people will leave with. And
That's
so
right.
it's the ultimate horror. But
yeah, well, I think this is a good time to just think about some of the drawbacks of virtue theory. Just like Schaefer-Landau does, and just like we've been doing with other theories, all of these theories of ethics, like they have their attraction. There are strengths of them. They fit our intuitions in some cases, or they underlie the right kind of moral judgments. We think they give us a very direct, explicit reason to explain why things like slavery or assault or murder are wrong. Instead of just saying it's wrong, isn't it obvious? There's like a theoretical kind of underpinning background. But just like with all of them, virtue theory too has some problems and some difficulties. The good thing is, since virtue theory doesn't really say a lot about how you treat other people other than you should act virtuously in your conduct with them, presumably that maybe allays some of the scope of the moral community stuff, right, that we've been talking about with these other things. A virtuous person is not going to treat someone who's very different than them badly, or at least they shouldn't, right, if they're being consistent. A virtuous person probably is not torturing animals, right? And so some of these worries about, human beings who maybe can't reason at a right kind of level, or animals that can't, like, in terms of the scope of the moral community, might be allayed by virtue theory, but also, virtue can be an excuse to be like, well, I'm virtuous and I'm focused on me, and maybe I don't care about those injustices that are happening. So, but it doesn't explicitly rule out or allow for this kind of abuse of members of what we would take to be part of the moral community that aren't, in the way that consequentialism and Kant do seem to have that problem. There are some problems, though. One, and this was discussed in the Pence text, and also a little bit, I think, in Schaefer-Landau, is the idea that virtue theory might not be a complete theory on its own. Right? Again, if I've got to figure out what is the content of my courage, what list of virtues is right, then that is going to be hard to answer from within a tradition if I don't want to just say, well, whatever my tradition says is right, right? It's a lot of rights in a row. So I might need a consequentialist or deontological theory to kind of inform my virtue theory. And so it might be a really good complement, but not a complete theory on its own. Again, there are virtue theorists that would disagree with this. This is part of why the exemplarist route people take a lot, because then they can say, well, no, the content is the wise person. I just need to do what they do, right? The other, and this is what Pence refers to as, I think, elimination out other moral theories. I don't need other moral theories. I can just be a virtue theorist. And that is, I think, a difficult, which is Schaefer-Landau discusses, and I actually think is the most telling objection to virtue theory from Schaefer-Landau in particular, and kind of relates to this earlier point, is the idea that virtue theory is going to have a kind of priority problem. So if I have a situation that arises and I could act either courageously or compassionately, which way should I act? And unless there's like a master virtue or a hierarchy, which virtue theory usually doesn't have, they usually doesn't have like a hierarchy, it's hard to tell. And in fact, some virtue theories will say, well, that's why in Aristotle, for example, wisdom is the highest virtue, because ideally your wisdom you'll be able to sort of ferret out what you should do in the situation. But that's not very helpful for most normal people who do not have this sort of perfect moral wisdom of, if I'm trying to be compassionate on the one hand, or say just, right? If you think about like justice and mercy by definition, it goes farther than justice, right? I am merciful to a person who doesn't deserve it, right? Whereas if I'm looking at justice, people get what they deserve. But you might think both of those are virtues. And so if a situation, if I could, if they conflict, which one should I do, right? And virtue theorists will say, well, this isn't like unique to us. Consequentialists have this problem, deontology just have this problem, but it is a difficulty. And in Kantian views, you could think there might be a way to explain that hierarchy, and in consequentialists, there might be a way to. But for virtue theorists, it's really hard to, unless you just have a master account or this kind of wisdom, it's going to be hard to figure out a principled reason why you should in one case do this versus another case. So I think that's all we have for today. So we hope that you've been enjoying the podcast and are enjoying kind of playing the game while we're helping you think about it and see it through the lens of history and philosophy. And we will look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yep.